Well, one of the main years that I remember in my lifetime was 1939. And someday, some historian will just take 1939 and start with January the 1st and go through, because it was the most interesting year. It was a year when we were still an innocent country. And by 1940, we grew up a great deal. And in 1939, I graduated from Penn State just in June of 1938, and I had just turned 20. So in 39, I was 21 years old, and living in Staten Island, and I had an opportunity to work at the World's Fair that was started in March of 39. And it was a fascinating time because the World's Fair was a very happy time, and with the most beautiful exhibits of the main countries of the world, France and England and Russia, all had big exhibits and big buildings, and it was the year of the Trilon and the Paris Fair. And I had the opportunity to work for the H.J. Heinz Company, and I was known as the Heinz Pickle Girl. We gave away little pickle pins and also free food, little crackers with peanut butter and maybe cream of spinach soup. And so it was the only free food at the World's Fair, so most everybody stopped in at the Heinz exhibit sometime or other. And I happened to meet re-meet him at the World's Fair, and he later became my husband. He was working at the Westinghouse exhibit. But it was a wonderful year and a happy year. The King and Queen of England came over, visited the fair. Of course, in those days, they didn't fly. You had to come by ship. And they came right by our exhibit. We girls stood in line at a corner. And I was right at the corner. I could have reached in the limo and touched the Queen, because she was sitting on my side. And she had pink cheeks and happy smile. And the reason that they came over, I didn't think about as much then because I was young, and that they came over to see President Roosevelt to ask for help for Lend-Lease and to help England that was then at war. That sets the scene for 1940. After the World's Fair, I stayed there until I guess it was the fall of 1939. And by that time, Rudy and I had fallen in love, and he went back to Pittsburgh to work for Westinghouse at Pittsburgh, and I went started a job after the World's Fair. I worked at Madison Avenue.
This is Manhattan, business center of New York City and heart of the city's life. Millions pour into the area every day to work and shop, to buy and sell.
Oh, I'm ahead of myself. I worked at James McCreary Company. I had hoped to work on Madison Avenue. That was my field, advertising and journalism. But it was very hard for a woman to get a job in 1939 in advertising. So I was told at J. Walter Thompson, which was the big agency at the time, that there was no place for a woman in advertising, but I could join the stenographic pool.
Pathé Pictorial, helpful as ever, hands out some hints to young ladies who fancy themselves as tomorrow's typists. Hints on how not to be a secretary. One thing the boss can't stand is a desk used as a dumping place for parcels or a dressing table for making yourself up. He's paying you to be a secretary, not an oomph girl.
And after spending 4 years at Penn State, hoping to end up on Madison Avenue, I was disappointed. But they said, so I thought, well, maybe if I got some selling experience and bide my time, eventually I'd get into Madison Avenue. So I worked at James McCreary, which was a large department store across the street from the Empire State Building on the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue. And while I was there, I met a very young, another nice young girl, and she had never been to Staten Island. That's where I was living with my aunt and uncle. So I invited her to come over on the ferry boat, since she had never been on a ferry boat, to come to Staten Island and spend the night with me. My aunt and uncle had a maid at the time, and her name was Taya Jackal, and she was German and a wonderful cook. So that night when I came home with my friend, I just can't remember her first name, but her last name I think was Leibowitz. And so I introduced her to Taya when I came home, because she was going to serve us, and she did, and she served us very grumpily, and she put the dinner down on the table in a way that not her usual fashion. So we went to bed that night, and the next morning we went off to work. And then I came home that night alone, and I said to Taya, and later in the evening, Taya, didn't you feel well last night? What was the matter? I said, you didn't seem very happy or well. She said, I don't serve Jewish people. So she evidently caught the name Leibowitz and my friend, and that set the scene for a very disruptive argument that she and I had about the state of the war, because up to this time, the United States, most of the people were very isolationist. And although we knew what was going on, we didn't know the depths of it. And the fact that here I was talking to somebody that was in our house that felt that way, it brought the whole thing, after the World's Fair, the beauty of it, and the fact that England was at war with Germany, and they had already progressed in Poland, the whole thing sort of opened up, and like a bad book. And so she and I had an argument that ended this way: Miss Doris, you are going to see the Nazi flag flying over New York City. Well, then by the next day she was gone, and she turned out that she had been a Nazi agent.
Interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin.
I just learned a secret. It's a honey. It's a pip. But the enemy is listening, so I'll never let it slip. 'Cause when I learn a secret, boy, I zipper up my lip. You bet I got a secret. And I bet we find it out. The soldier's got a secret, but I bet we find it out.
And with that, then came the FBI, and they had been evidently listening in on telephone conversations that she had been having. And they were very aware of the fact that she and her two friends were, in those days you would call them not spies, but agents, that because of the location of the house on the hill and the perfect view of the harbor of New York, she knew every ship that went by. And she was so intelligent. Whether she kept a log of it, that I don't know. And so that's the story of Taya Jackal, and how you could harbor an agent in your home and not know it. Well, the day that my brother came home was, as I recall, it was a spring day, and we had dinner that night. I just remember having dinner, and Kennard, we were all so relieved, but Kennard was very, very nervous. And after dinner, we all went into the living room, and naturally, we told him how blessed the family was, that he turned up as a prisoner of war. Kennard started talking more to the men, and then one thing led to another, and we were interested in the fact we didn't get into much about the actual march through France. I don't recall much of that, but he did discuss what we now call D-Day. We didn't call it then, he called it the landing day.
The curtain went up on June 6, 1944. I never think of Omaha as a big town in Nebraska, not anymore. To me, it's a piece of beach in Normandy that was hell.
So many of the boys drowned, and some of them that were in the boat with him drowned, and somehow he made it to the beach, and how bloody it was.
We were getting crowd artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire like rain, without even an umbrella for protection.
And screaming and hollering, and hollering and hollering. That's what he said. And with that, we all started to cry because he was so emotional. We were all emotional. I don't know about my uncle and Rudy, but I know Mother was crying and I was crying, and Jim, we were crying. And Kennard was crying and talking and crying and talking and walking up and down, and when he talked about his friend, the lieutenant, who lost his head on the beach, and they kind of had to go on, climb the wall, however.
We came close to being rained out, all right. But when Colonel Taylor of the 16th yelled, "Get the hell off the beach," we got the hell off and ran smack into hedgerow country where the crowd set up the fields like forts, using the hedgerows for walls.
And then, not too much about going through France. Maybe just mentioned about going through France and then battles in Germany. And the one battle that he talked about was the one when he was taken prisoner. And he didn't know the name of the battle then, nor did we. And it was called today it's called the Battle of Hartken Forest. And it was the bloodiest battle of the war.
But we hadn't seen the worst yet. Hurtgen Forest showed us that.
And Kennard said it, described it. He said, our boys were just about all killed. Today, it's quoted as 33,000 boys lost their lives.
If tree burst didn't get you, the weather did. Yeah, Hurtgen really trimmed down the outfit.
But he talked about that, about being taken prisoner of war, that he was in this muddy, bloody ditch. And it was, after the battle, it was quiet, moaning. And somebody kicked him, and he put up his hands, he looked up, and it was a German uniform. And he put up his hands and said, "Comrade." And the voice in English came out of this man that had a German uniform on. "It's okay, buddy. I should shoot you, but I'm going to take you prisoner." Whether he must have been one of the survivors or whether he was in on the cleanup operations, I don't know. And Kennard sat there, and he took him behind the lines for some distance where he lived. So maybe he was in the cleanup or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it was a house with a barn, a farm. And he told Kennard to stay in the barn. And when it got dark, his wife came out and gave Kennard a hot meal. He told Kennard that he had gone to school in the United States and he mentioned whether it was the University of Ohio, and that by some act of God or whatever, there he saved Kennard's life. So, and he did say, I don't want to, I don't want to be here, and you don't want to be here, but that's the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, the next morning, Kennard slept in the barn, and the next morning he came and he said, well, buddy, I have to take you prisoner. And he took Kennard to wherever the official place was, and then somehow Kennard got in a boxcar there with other prisoners of war. The battle was the western part of Germany, so they must have gone completely, in the boxcar, he must have gone completely across Germany to get to Stalag 3C, which was on the Oder River, which is, I think, the boundary between Germany and Poland at that time. And the food at the prison camp was mostly potato skin soup and rutabaga. He said they survived a lot on Red Cross packages and here and there. It was towards the end of the war, and when he was taken into the prison camp, there already were quite a few French boys there that evidently had been taken prisoner in the early days of the war when Germany was had Paris, had control of France. And he said that the Frenchmen was so clever that they had somehow managed to build a little shortwave radio that they kept under the boards of the floor. And they say they could keep track of pretty much they knew what was going on, and they made it out of little pieces of things that they got in the Red Cross packages, and I guess pieces of tinfoil. I really don't know, but it was very clever. He said that the boys, they were singing Christmas carols, and one of the guards, who was an older man, walked by them and without looking at them, reached in his pocket, and he had some hard candy that he had evidently gotten somewhere, and he threw it to the boys. So they had a little bit of hard candy from the prison card, and he thought then that all the Germans didn't want to be where they were either. He said that, for instance, that God showed his regard for human nature. He and two other boys decided that there was some kind of a skirmish in the front of the camp. I don't know what to call it other than a skirmish, whether somebody else had tried to escape. But anyhow, there was a skirmish, and Kennard and two other boys got out of the back of the camp, and they walked and escaped. They got into Poland and walked across Poland, mostly at night. And he said the Polish underground helped them, that the men wore something under their lapel, and if it was a member of the underground, he would just turn his lapel over and show so the boys were so Kennard and these two knew whether they were friends or not, and would point to where to go next. And Kennard said they approached one farm, and they were going to go in the barn and hide. And that night, they were the husband and the wife, the original owners evidently of the farm, were seen hanging. They had hung themselves to death, evidently. How long they had been there, he didn't know. But he had experiences like that. And another time, he said, they were so hungry, they had the soap with them that they had in the Red Cross packages, and they even ate some of the soap, I guess for the lard or whatever. And that they found a little baby or piglet running around in one of the farms. They grabbed it, and they said they were going to cook it, but they were too hungry, they couldn't wait. They hardly cooked it when they ate the piglet. But anyhow, then they progressed through Poland, and they went along, pretty much along the Russian lines. The Russians were coming west and they were going east. And they got to the supply line for the Russian army, and they walked down and got into Italy, walking. By the time they got to Italy, they were pretty emaciated. In fact, one of the boys died on the way somewhere in Poland. He didn't make it out of Poland. And then there were two of them. So the two boys, Kennard and his companion, ended up in a hospital, army hospital in Italy. And the boys were kept there a couple of weeks.
Summer 1945, and the war was 1 million men old. Hang on, kid. Keep your eyes shut tight and drink. They're moving you back now. Don't give up. Just hang on. The road back is bumpy and maybe the pain blurs your eyes. But listen. The sound of battle grows dim. And now one question cuts clearly through the haze. Which man will you be? The one who gets hurt and dies? Or the one who gets hurt and lives? When the dizziness stopped, when the fog cleared, an army nurse was at your side. A woman who meant safety and comfort and home to thousands of men before you.
And those two boys were then flown across the ocean to Miami. Now in those days, nobody flew except officers, so I guess because they were prisoners of war, they were flown back to the States and then put on a train to go to Washington, D.C. to be debriefed, to tell their story. But on the way between Miami and Washington, someplace in Georgia, the one boy either fell off the train or jumped off the train, I don't know. And I can't say for sure, but he was killed. So then only Kennard was left to go to Washington. And we had a call. I guess Kennard was whether he was in Miami at that time or Washington. We knew that, no, he called us from Washington because then he knew exactly when he would be home, what day. And he told us they'd be home on such and such a day, and that we could meet him, very definitely, not to come into the train station in New York, to meet him at the ferry boat when it came in at St. George, Staten Island, and not where the people got off the boat, which was upstairs in the ferry boat, but downstairs where the automobiles and trucks were, because he didn't want to be with the people. He knew it would be an emotional scene. So it was my mother and my, not my husband, but my aunt and uncle, myself, because it was during the week and Rudy had to work. And so we stood on land and watched the ferry boat come in, and Kennard was standing in the front, and just a skinny, tall man, and his legs were so thin in his heavy GI boots or shoes, whatever they were. They looked like spindles coming out of the shoes. And it was a very emotional homecoming. And that night, it had to be a Friday because then my husband, we were living in Philadelphia, so he came up from his office in Westinghouse office in Philadelphia, and we all sat up, had dinner, then we all sat up until the wee hours of morning, and maybe it was almost daylight. And Kennard told the whole story of his stay in the war amidst tears and sobbing. When he finished, and he said, "Don't ever ask me anything about the war again." And nobody ever did. He went to Lake Placid, New York, where they had R&R for the soldiers. They took the Lake Placid Club. That's where they had the Olympics at one time. It was in the Adirondack Mountains. And they took the whole hotel, and it was filled with boys that were emotionally disturbed. But Kennard was not as bad as some of the other boys, so he was made an MP there. In other words, he was there, but he wasn't there. And so he had a job to do, and that was he had to go in town, in the town of Lake Placid, at a certain time at night, say 9 o'clock at night, make sure that there weren't any stragglers, that all the boys were back, and I guess in this R&R place, or hospital, I don't know what they called it. And that was his duty there. But I guess at the same time, he was undergoing some kind of treatment. And when that was over, he came home, and we thought he should go back to school, to Penn State. And then we found out that they wouldn't take him because his grades weren't high enough. There were so many GIs coming home that wanted to use the GI plan to go to college, that those that had started had to have high grades in order to get back in. And Kennard's he was not the kind of a student that ever achieved very highly. He just always made it, and that satisfied him. It was always, he could have done better, but he never did. He always used to say, if 75 passes, that's fine with me. So anyhow, when I found out that they wouldn't take my brother back, and I was a graduate of Penn State, my husband was a graduate of Penn State, I sat down and I wrote a letter to the Dean of Returning GIs. And he happened to be an English professor. Can't remember his name, but I know that I remember his wife well, because she was a sorority sister of mine. And I wrote him a letter saying that it was his patriotic duty to allow my brother to return to school, because there was no place for him at the time in society. That he was lost, but he wanted to go. He wanted to go back to Penn State, and fortunately, they did accept Kennard, and that was what changed his life around. Because while he was there, he got, from getting just passing grades, he got 3s, which is top grade. He met a lovely girl by the name of Marigold Kinney, whose father was a professor at Penn State, and they fell in love, and she and both my brother and she got their masters together, and in geography, and my brother became a geography professor, and ended up teaching at the University of Iowa and in the SUNY system of New York in Brockport, New York. That's what Marigold did for my brother, Kennard, because he really truly was lost when the war was over, and he couldn't focus on anything. But by going back to school and meeting the right person and the right family, the Kinney family, they took him in. Marigold was an only child. They took him in as a son, and he lived with them. It just changed his life around. And so to this day, I thank dear Marigold for saving my brother. So that's it. The story ended happily in that respect. But I must say this: my brother never spoke of the war again, and we never asked him any questions about it, except that one time his daughters Debbie and Laurie asked him. They had a project in school where they were asked to write something about either their father's experiences or something about a war, and so they innocently said, "Daddy, you can help us," and he said to them very gruffly, I don't want to speak about the war. And so they knew enough that they never did. And so Kennard died with the many secrets of World War II in his heart. And he told me, "Sis, if I don't have a little bit to drink before I go to bed," he used to have a shot of vodka, he said, "I could never sleep." Now, whether he did that all the time he was teaching or not, but in his later years, after Marigold passed away and he spent some years with me, he said that to me, that his dreams were always going back to World War II. But he did surmount it. Some of the boys did and some never did. And so we're fortunate in that respect that he did.